today is prose fiction, right? Prose fiction. So, broadly speaking, we are on form and genre section of our course. Under form and genre, we have already discussed poetry. We discussed important features of poetry. Today, we are going to start the other section, another section, a new section under the heading form and genre. That section is called prose fiction. So prose fiction can more easily be identified if we know the subgenres that it has. There are three major subgenres of prose fiction. They are called novel, short story, novella. What is a novel? Novel basically is a fictional narrative that is long enough to be published as a book by itself. Examples are War and Peace by Tolstoy, Ulysses by James Joyce, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I'm sure most of you have heard about at least one of these novels in the past. If not these, you are aware of some other novels other than these three that you must have heard in the past. The other subgenre is short story. Short story is a narrative of small length that usually cannot be published as an independent book. So The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe is a short story. Novella. Novella is a narrative of in-between length 80 to 100 pages. The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway is a famous novella. So novella is smaller than a novel, but bigger than a short story. It is published as an independent book. Now, you might have noticed I have used the word narrative so many times. Okay, on this slide, and then on this slide as well. Right? So I kept saying that novel is a narrative of bigger length, short story is a narrative of small length, and novella is a narrative of medium length. The question is, what is a narrative? So narrative is a sequence of events, which could be fictional, which could be non-fictional, told or narrated by someone, the narrator, to someone else. So when we read a narrative, we are reading events described in a particular order, in a sequence. Now, one thing that we should not forget is that when we are reading a narrative, a novel, or short story, or a novella, there is an individual who narrates those events. The person who narrates those events is called the narrator. The narrator does not have to be the writer. This is a very fine distinction that you must keep in mind. The narrator does not have to be the author. So every short story or novel or novella that you read has an author. Great Expectation, Charles Dickens. Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte. Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte. So every story that you read has an author. But every story that you read has a narrator as well. So whenever you read a story, somebody narrates the story. Author does not necessarily narrate it. So when an author writes a story, the author creates the narrator. The author creates the narrator as well as narrative. So the narrator and the narrative both are products of the author's mind. So the story is told from the perspective of the narrator in the story. Let's move on. The components of narrative. So when you read a story, you come across these components. The first one is either prose or verse. The narrative could be in prose or it could be in verse. So the Greek epics have been written in verse form, and the green epics are narratives. But in this course, we are not dealing with the narratives in prose, in verse. We are dealing with the narratives in prose only. The second component of a narrative is a plot. So a plot is a sequence of developments in a narrative. It is the bare minimum skeleton, the bare minimum skeleton of the story. For example, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, a famous novel. One could say that its plot is about a little boy who gets rejected by his family and his society. And therefore, he works hard to grow himself into a gentleman. This is the plot. You know, this novel encompasses about 300 plus pages. It's a huge novel. But its plot is just this. You can write the plot of a whole novel in maybe a paragraph only. So plot is the minimum, bare minimum sequence of developments in a story. Plots could be comic, plots could be tragic. Usually, if all the characters survive towards the end of the story, the plot is comic. If one or more character lose their lives towards the end of the story, that is tragic plot. Similarly, plots could be with happy endings or unhappy endings. Usually when they have a happy ending, there is a reunion towards the end of the plot or towards the end of the story. And if there is an unhappy endings, then there are any separations in the story. The third component of a narrative is characters. There could be round characters, there could be flat characters. Who are the characters? Characters are the individuals in a story. They have their names. They are identified with the place also. And they are described in great detail by the writer. They look like alive characters. They look like alive individuals. There are two kinds of characters, round and flat. Round character is one which keeps changing, which undergoes changes in a story. So for example, a character might have some flaws in the beginning of the story, but towards the end of the story, that particular character overcomes those flaws. For example, the character was immature in the beginning. Here he commits some serious mistakes and faces punishment for that. And based on that, learns new lessons. When that happens, we would say that this kind of character is a round character because it changes over the time. Flat character is the one which does not change. It remains same throughout the story. Of course, the author decides which character would be round and which would be flat. Then the next component of a narrative is its setting. The story or a novel or a novella or a narrative always has a setting. Setting is the physical context within which the story or narrative takes place. That physical context could be, for example, a living room, a house, slums, farmhouse, a landscape, crowded city, or suburban village, suburban area, or villages. It could be a prison too. It could be a hospital. It could be a university or college. These are all possible settings of a narrative. The writer of a narrative chooses the setting very carefully. There is a strong compatibility between the characters and the setting in which they live. So if the character is shown to be a poor person, then the setting has to be that of slums. The house where the character lives should be a poor dwelling or poor residence, unless the novelist has something in mind different. Maybe if the novelist is putting a poor character as a servant in a house, then in that case, that house will be a lavish house, a rich house. But as I said, that a novelist chooses the setting very carefully. Setting directly contributes to the development of the narrative. And finally, suspense. Suspense probably is the most important component in a narrative, in the sense that it is because of the suspense that the narrative becomes popular. So narrative is the most read form in literature. Okay, so there are other forms like poetry, drama, but it is the novel which is read the most. One major reason for that is the element of suspense that the writer puts in a story or a novel or novella. So what is suspense? Suspense is waiting to discover what comes next. While you are waiting to discover what comes next, that is suspense. So the novelist does not disclose everything in the beginning. The novelist keeps certain secrets about the characters, about their actions, and unfolds them gradually. So we continue to read a novel or a short story just to know what happens next to this character, to a particular character. It's called suspense. So we learned about prose fiction today. Under prose fiction, we learned that there are three kinds of prose fiction: novel, novella, short story. And we learned that all of them have a narrative in them. Narrative is the sequence of events. And we also learned that a narrative has certain features or components. It could be prose or verse. It must have a plot. It must have characters. It must have a setting. It must have suspense in it. Right? It's time for questions.